Programming is made possible in part by the Friends of WILL and
Pioneers is made possible in part by the Knoll Foundation and by the donors to the Champaign 150th Anniversary Celebration Fund. More information on the city's 150th anniversary is at champaign150.com. With special thanks to the Office of Corporate Relations at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and Kyle and Phyllis Robeson.
Extra! The newspaper delivery boy would cry out as he delivered a daily dose of history right to your doorstep. Tonight on Illinois Pioneers, we deliver a dose of Champaign history about the earliest days of newspapers, radio, and television. Roll the presses and stand by for air. Illinois Pioneer starts right now.
Welcome to Illinois Pioneers. I'm John Paul. The daily stories told by the media are a big part of the fiber and fabric of any community. Tonight, with the help of some great old photographs and two media historians, we're going to look back at the earliest days of newspapers and at the arrival of radio and TV in our area. With me tonight, Tom Kacich, a veteran reporter and columnist for the Champaign-Urbana News-Gazette. Tom is quite passionate about local history, and he is the author of a book called Hot Type about local history and news over the past 150 years. Also here, Doug Quick, a TV weather anchor at WICD TV and a radio personality in the area. Doug is also a broadcast historian. Doug created a website called dougquick.com all about Central Illinois radio and TV history. Welcome to both of you tonight. You know, I have to say, when I pick up the paper and read the paper, I didn't realize just what went into putting this thing together, physically putting it together. So what we thought we'd start off with tonight is a look at what it looks like to physically put the paper together every day. Let's take a look at the press run from the News-Gazette, and it'll give you some idea of what it's like to see the paper put together on a daily basis. And I see big rolls, so big rolls in the basement, and the paper actually flows up, right?
Up to the press.
Up to the press, and you were telling me that this process is new and different, even though it seems very, in some ways, antiquated.
Oh yeah, there's been presses like this for more than hundreds of years, obviously, but newspaper presses have become more modern, but essentially the technology is the same it was 100 years ago.
Paper didn't fly quite this fast, I'll bet.
It did not.
In the 1800s.
It did not.
And it's amazing, I guess, to see what goes into it. There's a lot more color in the newspaper today than there used to be.
There was no color when I started in 1975, and now it's virtually everywhere. And there's some papers that have color on every page.
Well, let's get into some of the photographs that we've got tonight and talk a little bit about newspaper, radio, and television history. Let's start, Tom, if we can, with the very earliest, at least, known photograph of the News-Gazette. This is the Gazette building, I guess it was called at that point.
Right.
Tell me where this is. What are we looking at?
This is at the southeast corner of Main Street and Neal in Champaign. And this building stood until around 1935, 36. Later became a Kresge store, but this was one of the first offices of a daily newspaper in Champaign.
So do you call this an ancestor or a predecessor to the News-Gazette?
Yeah, an ancestor.
Because it was a different paper at that point.
Yes, there were many ancestors. The first one was the Urbana Union, which was obviously published in Urbana.
And in fact, let's go to the next image here. You can see some of the mastheads from all of these papers. The Urbana Union goes back to 1850.
1852, yeah. First paper in Champaign County.
And the others, as it progressed, the Union and Gazette comes along, the Central Illinois Gazette, the Champaign County Gazette. We're seeing Gazette theme here.
Yeah.
These all in the 1800s at this point.
Correct, yeah. Newspapers were generally a secondary business for a printer. They would, publish advertisements and handbills, and the circus is coming to town, things like that. And when they had the extra paper and extra press, they would put out a newspaper instead.
Let's go to the other one, and we'll show you the next line here. The Champaign Daily News, a competition for those others?
Correct. Competitor. It started around, I think, around 1890, 1895, and it was more like a yellow journalism sheet. This guy, his name was E.B. Chapin, and he lived in Tolono, and he liked to stir things up, and it wasn't always factual, but he did create some news.
And at the time the Champaign Daily News is out, 4 newspapers in Champaign-Urbana during the turn of the century.
Right.
The Daily News, the Gazette, the previous one we saw on the last page, along with the other papers.
The Courier was in Urbana, and then the Illini, which was on campus, a student publication, which wasn't a daily paper, wasn't a weekly, it was maybe 2 or 3 times a week.
And that's pretty common, though, for many communities to have many papers.
Oh yeah, in that time, yeah.
In that time.
Absolutely. And there were later people would put out a paper for a month or two. In the 20s and 30s, they thought they could make a go of it, and it didn't quite make it. So the only ones that really survived were essentially the News-Gazette and the Courier.
This is called the masthead, right?
Correct.
That's what we're looking at. So really, the last 2 look very similar here to most of us.
Right.
What's the slight distinction between those 2?
Oh, that I don't know.
Typeface looks very similar.
Yeah, that's it. But I can tell you the News and the Gazette merged in 1919. And there had been a shakeup there was a recession after the war, and a lot of papers merged, and that's what happened here as well. And
all of them local ownership, though.
Right. No chains then.
Absolutely no chain. Still no chain today.
Right. Correct. We're virtually the only paper in the Midwest.
You talked about 1919. Let's go to our next image, and I want to show you another photograph. This, I believe, is the corner of, this is now what's the Stevic building where the paper's printed.
Correct. This is where I started in journalism.
With those trucks?
No, but just about. But that you'll notice that was a 4-story building at the time. It's now 2-story. So sometime between 1915 and maybe 1960, they knocked off 2 stories. That was not quite a safe building, apparently.
How many people work at a newspaper today? Roughly 100?
Oh,
200?
I'd say maybe 200. Yeah.
200, and many of those in the process, in advertising, in areas other than the reporting and writing. Right?
Yeah, composing and advertising and delivery, customer service, printing, and then the newsroom.
There were a lot of people then employed by all these newspapers over the years, writing stories about their communities.
Right. Lots, many more then. It was more of a tedious and more of a manual operation then than it is now. It's much more computerized and much more modern, but there were a lot of people who had jobs in newspapers in those days.
Let's switch to another image, too. This one, the Urbana Daily Courier, this one from about 1919, obviously World War I here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the layout of the paper a little bit different at this point, but all of them were, if I get this right, not tabloid papers, but broadsheet papers, like the Gazette is today.
Right. The big thing you'll notice, and there was virtually no art. There were no photos in these papers until local photographs didn't become common until the 1930s. You would occasionally have a mugshot of the president or some other well-known figure, but there really weren't many photos.
But photography does come in the, you said, about 20s or 30s.
Correct.
Obviously, in the Capone era, we saw a lot of pretty extensive photographs in Chicago newspapers at that point. Let's move on to another photograph that I think many of us think all editors at newspapers do this every day, wear those visors. True?
Not anymore. No, people don't look like that at all. For one thing, we have women.
Women doing the process.
Yes. Yeah.
But it was a pretty male-oriented industry.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And if there were women, they worked in the society section. They worked, covering weddings and that kind of stuff.
And I want to move on to ownership of the newspaper. And let's go to the next graphic. This is David Stevic.
David Stevic, he dropped out of school at the age of 15 to work at a paper in Bloomington, Illinois. And he had newspaper in his, newsprint in his blood. and moved to Champaign in 1915 and bought his own little newspaper with another guy, and then eventually became the sole owner.
And the other image I have of Mr. Stevick at a later point in his life passed away from a heart attack today?
Correct. He died at the age of 48. So
Newspaper business pretty hard on him, huh?
Well, he had a car accident in Kankakee in 1927, and after that he was never quite the same. And he had also operated a newspaper in Texarkana, Texas, which apparently was not as successful as the News-Gazette, and that took a lot out of him.
And the David W. Stevick will come back. Those initials will come back later that Doug will talk to us about in a few minutes. He's married to a woman named Helen Stevick. In our next graphic, we see young Helen. And then in our next graphic, we see an older Helen Stevick. And she takes over the paper after his death.
Upon his death in 1935, and she lives until 1968, and she, was never really cut out to be a businesswoman or a journalist, but she did a pretty good job operating the News-Gazette through some tough times, during the Depression and during a real onslaught of competition from the Courier.
Really a family-oriented business because it's handed down again, if we'll switch to the next graphic, to their daughter.
Their one and only child, Marion Stevick Kinigo,
who passed away really not all that long ago.
Yeah, 2003.
And the paper today is owned and run how?
By a foundation that's has almost virtually all local board, and the proceeds from the foundation go to 2 local charities, go to the U of I Foundation, the Community Foundation.
When we think of the people's names associated with newspapers, sometimes we see a little picture of you guys who write. One of the reporters that I think stands out is the next one. If you go to the next image, Ed Borman.
Ed Borman,
who covered area stories for many, many years, right?
I think he started at the Gazette in like 1937, 38, and lived until the late 70s. And the News-Gazette was the only place he ever worked.
Well, that's true for many people that work in media.
Yeah.
Gets in the blood. Let's move on to the early 1920s, Doug, when the magic of radio arrives in Champaign-Urbana. This is the one of the original towers for WRM radio. Arrives in 1922.
That's right. It was called We Reach Millions. It signed on a couple of years after KDKA in Pittsburgh. A lot of AM radio stations back in those days didn't actually have broadcast towers, but actually broadcast from wires strung between towers. No sign of any wires there, unless it's running down through the center of the tower, which was pretty common.
But a big old building there, probably to house all the electronics.
I would imagine so. That technology took a lot of space, a lot of heat from vacuum tubes and such, and a lot of power. The wattage of the station at that time was probably in the neighborhood of 250 watts, which is a couple of light bulbs, but it was enough to send out a significant signal. Now, in 1928, I believe, the call letters were changed to WILL.
And let's move on to our next photograph, some of those early studio days when there were live performances.
There you go.
Much of early radio was live?
Yeah. In fact, for a long time, virtually all of local radio was live. We're talking live entertainment, live musical acts, because the Musicians Union didn't like the idea of playing pre-recorded music. So transcriptions later came in. I think the Musicians Union gave a little bit and allowed the use of transcription recordings.
Let's go to another image here too. University of Illinois students. It was WILL, but we do see the studio cueing the student.
That is typical radio sign language when the master control was on the other side of the mic, and use of hand signals. There you go, a classic study in hand signals.
And another one from the early 1950s at WILL. If you go to the next graphic, this is the broadcast booth in Huff Gym, which you still see there today, and we see 580 kilocycles there on the left. This is Fred Corey and Jim Ebel doing the broadcast. This was at a point when any radio station could do sports broadcast.
Right.
And sports broadcasts were vital
Yeah, and in fact, sports broadcasting, I remember the Danville station where I spent a lot of time from the late 1970s through the 80s also broadcast U of I sports. I think individual stations all over the state were actually broadcasting U of I sports, and it wasn't until later that they actually went to a network.
Now, another radio station comes along in 1938 from
Right.
Champaign-Urbana, and this one's out in the country, so to speak, on South Neal
Right.
Street, WDWS.
Yeah, the application was made back in 1935, and of course we talked about Mr. Stevick there dying in December of 1935, but the pursuit of the station was continued by his wife Helen, and eventually in 1937, actually, January 24th, they went on the air from the second floor of the News-Gazette building in downtown. And of course the call letters, a living memorial to Mr. Stevick was a CBS affiliate. So that means it probably broadcast a lot of the old Jack Benny shows and Burns and Allen and such during prime time, and a lot of the daytime serials and such. And it's amazing how much the neighborhood has changed.
Yeah, neighborhood's changed a little bit. That's South Neal Street, Route 45 there that we see. Let's go on to our next picture. And again, for radio people.
Well, that is a huge transmitter there in the background with the call letters on it, very typical at the time. WDWS had the luxury of not being a directional facility, so you didn't have something called a phasing cabinet that took up a lot of space, but probably a 1,000-watt transmitter. They probably lowered the power in the evening. 1400 was what was called a local channel. There were probably 80 different radio stations all broadcasting from that same frequency across the country, and they would have to protect the other stations by lowering power at night to try to cut down on skywave. Unfortunately, it probably limited the reach of the station, much like what it does today, even though I think they're probably 1,000 watts at night, but it just doesn't get that far.
And major celebrities, next image is would come through. The 1, 2, 3, fourth man from the left is Guy Lombardo.
Guy Lombardo, right.
Who would come through, and I think that's Guy's brother, who was also, excuse me, band director with some of the WDWS
Probably wasn't taken on New Year's Eve. I'm
and
sure
a radio
he had an
program
engagement
that
night.
exists today on WDWS, Penny for Your Thoughts. You'll see in the next image a letter that WDWS would send to people, penny for your thoughts. They literally sent people a penny at that point. When you called in and shared your thoughts, you had a penny back. This is from May of 1949.
And that's back when a penny would actually buy something.
Yeah.
At least gumball. At least. Next image, one of the personalities that many people heard on WDWS, Larry Stewart. And the next image, two guys that you still hear on the radio today. On the left, Mr. Turpin, and on the right, Mr. Tate, who works in your building too, but also has dabbled in broadcasting.
Oh, yeah. The amazing Mr. Tate, star of TV, radio, newspapers.
Doug, in the early 50s, the magic of television arrives. And let's go to the next image. And the first station to get on the air is this one.
Well, this was the first one in the Champaign area. The first station actually signed on across central Illinois was WTVP, Channel 17 in Decatur. They went on the air in, let me think here, August 16th of 1953. Right after the freeze was lifted, July 1st, 1952, all of these radio station or prospective radio station groups applied for licenses. There were actually two people that applied for the license for Channel 3. One of them was Midwest Television, headed by August C. Meyer.
And let's switch to the next image.
And the other group was actually from one of the local newspapers, the Urbana Courier, which was a Lindsay Schaub paper. And Merrill Lindsay had made the application for Channel 3. His friends or people that liked Augie Meyer probably call him Augie, and I will refer to him in that with all due respect. But he was a brilliant guy as far as playing the chess game of early broadcasting. One thing he did was in order to cut down on the time that the FCC was going to take to decide which group would actually get Channel 3, he offered that other group 20% ownership into Midwest Television, which they agreed to and got it finalized to one group applying for Channel 3 and got it. He also faced another challenge in the building of the actual tower that was originally supposed to go in Whiteheath, and they had a groundbreaking ceremony there near Whiteheath, and Channel 17, WTVP in Decatur, filed against them as infringing on their so-called territory. It was a little too close to Decatur. So in order to avoid the fight that would probably take place with the FCC, he agreed to move the transmitter a few miles to the east, which they picked up the current Seymour site, and that original tower stands. 1,000-foot tower, which was one of the tallest structures at that time in the state of Illinois.
This next picture we see, we're going to see a tower, but this actually is a photograph of the studios and the tower, the studio transmitter link along Neal Street at this
Right.
point.
The studio was actually located in a former tire store along South Neal.
Still is.
There were plans, yes, there were plans to move to a television campus on South Neal, right next to WDWS. That plan was given up at some point or another, and instead it was made into a golf course called Par 3. But that original microwave transmitting tower that would send the signal out to the transmitter point still stands behind the building of Channel 3 there on South Neal.
Let's move on to a few more photographs, quite a few to get through here. One of the early advertisements for Channel 3, quite a lot of programming that people remember. And Doug, you said they were both NBC and CBS.
Right. Originally, Mr. Meyer really did, again, a brilliant guy. He cornered CBS, which was the #1 TV network at that time, #1 radio network, and they had all the stars. And he locked them up for the entire central Illinois area, virtually locking anybody else out from CBS, and took on a secondary NBC affiliation in December of 1953 after the station signed on. That allowed him to air shows like Dragnet, Your Hit Parade, and some of the others that were Milton Berle, for instance, that were all NBC shows, but they were able to show them via kinescope, that is, filmed recordings of the live broadcasts.
Let's move on to a studio shot here. This is one of the early news broadcasts. Fred Sorensen, the anchor at that point, the first news anchor, and as you can see, the sports scores at that point done on chalkboard, the Dumont school scoreboard. And then, Doug, in just a matter of months, another radio station comes into the area, or another television station, next picture please, comes into the area, WDAN 24.
Yes, this was an outgrowth of the WDAN radio that went on the air in 1938. It was owned by Northwest Publishing in Danville, and Channel 24 went on the air. A lot of these newspapers got into the TV business simply to corner the competition. They were able to control any kind of loss of advertising revenue by owning a TV station, and unfortunately they went in at it on the cheap. They didn't do a good job of putting the station on.
Give me some help with this next image here. Can you tell me who these guys are?
Sure. The person on the left is Max Schaefer, who managed WDAN radio for a number of years through the late 70s. The person in the middle is Robert Burrow. He was the first general manager of WDAN TV. He was already manager of the radio station. And the gentleman on the right is John Eckert. I worked with him for a period of time in the late 70s when I started at WDAN DNL. Back in 1977, he was a sales manager there, a terrific guy.
We want to show a few of the personalities, but before we get there, the WDAN television signal got into Champaign. Next image, and you'll see WICD. We had 33 WCHU was the translator.
In 1960, Plains Television Partnership, who owned Channel 20 in Springfield, purchased Channel 24 after just putting WCHU Channel 33 on the air here in Champaign from the Inman Hotel. They had a terrific signal that got out 15 miles. That was it. Channel 24 filled in the hole over in the Danville area. Could they have taken WCHU to a full power station and not purchased Channel 24? Probably. But at that particular time, it left themselves open. It's a very strong possibility that the ownership of WTVP in Decatur may have purchased Channel 24, which put a duopoly in the market early on and would have taken revenue from Channel 33. So
let's look at a few of the faces that people will remember from local television. Next image here, WICD image, where we need to go to.
That was after 1967 when the stations combined to 15.
And then the next image, a face that all of us remember from weather.
Sure.
Wyndham Roberts, who did weather on Channel 3 for many years. The next one, many of the staff at Channel 3, Scott Craig,
right.
Mr. Roberts, John Coleman, who
right.
did the hop, we'll see him in a minute, Sheriff Sid Perry, Our next picture, Keith Page.
Our friend Keith Page doing a Team Soda commercial back when they were doing live commercials.
Live,
Absolutely.
Yeah. In next image from the WCIA studios along Neal Street, people will remember those big pictures out front. And then another thing that happened in the next image, you'll see Paul Davis, who hired me into this business.
It's really interesting. The news anchors back at that time actually did commercials.
Yeah,
They
and
actually
we
did live
see
commercials.
beer advertisements. Another face in the next image that is also familiar, Tom Jones, who did sports for many years. And cooking shows were big. In the other image, you'll see Diane Johnson doing Happy Home Show on WCIA. And then two or three more images here to get through real quickly. This next one, Sheriff Sid Perry, and then a show that I think many teenagers really liked, copied after American Bandstand. Is that right?
Right.
This next image, The Hop, John Coleman.
The
hosted.
original host, John Coleman, later hosted by my friend Ed Mason. So.
But copied after American Bandstand, right?
Absolutely. John Coleman actually spun his own records. He was actually a DJ there, and he was probably one of the first VJs, I guess.
Just one more image to show you before we leave, and it's a young punk that happened to get into television at some point in his career there at Channel 3 back in the old newsroom. That's me back in the late 70s. So television kind of comes full circle. Gentlemen, thank you very much for this discussion and look back. It's kind of fun to walk down memory lane again.
It's always great. Visit my website. I've got all the information.
DougQuick.com has a lot on it. I know the News-Gazette did a big supplement in 2002. I don't know if that's still available to somebody if they want to come in, but
And the book
might
is.
be. Book is too. Hot
Yep,
Types, another book too. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. That's it for this edition of Illinois Pioneers. My thanks to our guests tonight, Doug Quick and to Tom Kacich, for their passion, too, for preserving media history. It's really important. In one of the upcoming editions of Illinois Pioneers, we'll remember an era of bootlegging and vice right here in Champaign, plus ride with us as we ride the streetcars and the interurban. Good night.
Programming is made possible in part by the Friends of WILL and
Pioneers is made possible in part by the Knoll Foundation and by the donors to the Champaign 150th Anniversary Celebration Fund. More information on the city's 150th anniversary is at champaign150.com. With special thanks to the Office of Corporate Relations at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and Kyle and Phyllis Robeson.